Welcome to Dimensional Shift, where we explore and actively deprogram ourselves, seek the truth of reality through expanding our perceptions, and focus on full remembrance of our true selves. As we begin to connect to our true selves, we will also see the truth of this illusory reality and the way it controls us through our manipulated perceptions. As soon as we fully remember our true selves, we will also see the enemy for what it is and how to rebalance the system by freeing ourselves and assisting others to do the same, creating a domino effect into the evolution of human consciousness. Hey, welcome back to Dimensional Shift. Today we're talking about blind spots and your self-destruct button. This has brought up a lot of really interesting programming of my own. Normally, these podcasts get outlined in a flurry of inspiration, and then I go and record them, and it just kind of happens. It's not something I pre-plan. It's not very contrived. It's just inspiration. And Saturday at noon, I outlined this podcast, and it flowed out, and I knew it was going to be really important. And I still know it's going to be really important based on the fact that I have spent all weekend avoiding recording it. Saturday afternoon, I spent 4.5 hours staring at my notes, wondering why I couldn't just record this. And even though I realized it's because I was under a very targeted attack, it still was really hard to get out of. And as I'm recording this now, it's Sunday, almost noon, I'm still shaking. I am terrified of the pushback I'm going to get, but this episode feels really, really important to get out there. So I'm going to do it scared this week. I think that's okay. I think that it's important to make that conscious choice instead of letting the programming activate and keep us pushed down, which is the whole point of this podcast. It's very ironic the way that it's come up. So I want to start with how programming gets activated. And what happens is a frequency gets put out. It's a frequency that's kind of like imposed on us. It's something that gets put out so that we are kept pushed in a certain direction. If you've ever seen The Adjustment Bureau, it's got Matt Damon and I think it's Emily Blunt. That's a really good example of how this works. These frequencies are put out to basically keep us pushed towards a certain direction. And in the movie, they call it, quote, on plan. And so this frequency is put out, a trigger happens, and then we run our programming. The whole point of the frequency is for something to come up in our system to trigger the programming, and the programming is the behavior that they want to elicit. Most people are familiar with the term resonance, but they have this weird association with something that they like or agree with, and that's not really true. Resonance is anything that's going to affect you a certain way. It's the frequency that they're putting out that's catching onto your system and creating that trigger and then activating the programming. So there's different kinds of triggers that can happen. There's an emotional trigger where someone says something and you feel that instant emotion, that instant feeling of shame or whatever it is. There's mental triggers, which would be suddenly you start thinking about how you made that mistake and now everybody's going to hate you and all of that kind of stuff. There's physical triggers, which could be like a sudden headache, relationship triggers, someone having a bad day and taking it out on you. There's circumstantial triggers, suddenly having access to a harmful substance that you shouldn't be taking. And of course, all of these can be working together or they can have a cascade effect. And the problem comes in when we start to identify with those triggers, because that's what they are. They're meant to activate the programming. And the point is to not allow us to have a choice. It's to keep us influenced now and to create an anchor, like a memory anchor for the future. So, well, I made this choice in the past, and therefore I'll probably make it again in the future. If you want to know more about programming and conditioning, I recommend you go back and listen to episode 23 if you haven't. And I have several episodes that I'll be recommending throughout this episode. I'll have those all in the show notes. So blind spots are some of the hardest programming to recognize because it involves things that we don't want to look at, either about ourselves or about other people. Often it involves people we care about. For example, recognizing that someone in your life has been abusive, that's really hard to look at, especially if you really care about them. your ego automatically wants to protect them, and it wants to protect you, because then you also have to recognize that, number one, they've been abusing you, number two, in some way you've been allowing it, and number three, how you're going to get out of it. It again goes back to that identity. If you want to learn more about egoic constructs, episode 25 is what you'll want to listen to. Our ego is meant to keep us alive. That's literally the point of the ego, is survival. And that has been weaponized against us. Most people think the ego is what you want to detach from and get rid of and kill the ego. It's a very common thing. But the ego itself can't really die because it is the impulse to survive. And what happens if you get rid of that impulse to survive? You're going to die. The way that it's been weaponized against us, however, with the programming and all of this keeping us, quote, on plan, all of that, it's been weaponized. And then the loop is that the ego then defends the programming. These are the blind spots. Wherever you identify with your programming, wherever your ego defends the programming, is a blind spot. Some of the ways you can start recognizing these blind spots are by looking at the themes and cycles in your life. There's going to be correlations between the types of people, the places, the feelings, the reactions you've had. For example, one of the most famous Freudian things is you always marry someone who is like one of your parents, right? And I had a very huge blind spot about this because the guy I chose to marry seemed very much the opposite of my dad in a lot of ways, in almost every way. And yet I recognized just this past week how in many ways they were very much the same, but it's in all of the dark, sinister ways I didn't want to look at. And so it was a blind spot. And having to look at that, it was very traumatizing, and it was really ugly to look at the way that had been patterned throughout my life. And all work toward one goal, which is death programming. And we're going to get into that in just a couple of minutes. Death programming blind spots are especially hard to see because it's programming that's installed during trauma times. And if you know anything about trauma, which most of us do, trauma not only creates a sense of separation and almost depersonalization, but we often associate it with memory gaps, repressed emotions, things like that. And so trying to look at something when you don't have the actual memories there is often very difficult. So you may have to do it in layers. And having someone to help you look through your patterns and call out blind spots or find those correlations that you may not be seeing will help a lot. So then we get into the way these triggers and the programming is stacked against us. And this has to go into how they rig the game. And if you want to hear more about spiritual targeting, that's episode 24. So many times these triggers I call it pre-stacking. It doesn't really mean anything, but events and circumstances are often primed before the actual trigger. These circumstances feel controlled when they first start, and sometimes they even look like lucky circumstances. But when you start reflecting on how it happens before a trigger comes up, you can see that it was planned that way. Sometimes this looks like having access to money, or suddenly getting access to a substance, or getting to hang out with someone that you like only to find out that it leads to regretful things. This is the way that they keep us shuffled into activating this programming. And then later they can say, see, you did it again. It goes back to the saying, if it looks too good to be true, it probably is. It starts with a fortuitous circumstance, then there's the frequency, then there's the trigger, and then you run your programming. And then eventually you go through it again. There's also the way that other people are used against us. These frequencies aren't exclusive to people who are targeted. People in our lives have their own resonances and programming that come up. The problem is when we start reacting to the way that they have reacted to their frequencies. And oftentimes people can't even explain their behavior. Well, I didn't mean it that way, or I don't know why I'm so grouchy, right? And this can lead to gaslighting on our end, because then we feel like maybe we misunderstood, or that it creates a little bit of that crazy making kind of thing. And it can condition us to react a certain way for future events. if you've ever had any kind of narcissistic relationship, you know that there's a lot of conditioning that goes on. And that conditioning can spread into other areas of our life and into other relationships in our lives too. It's like the saying in the Matrix, where everyone in the Matrix is a potential agent. And you have to also be willing to look at how you have been influenced to create conditioning in other people and to be an unwittingly influenced person that other people are targeted through as well. And all of this adds together for your self-destruct button. Now, the self-destruct button is death programming, essentially. But the term death programming doesn't have to only mean physical death. These blind spots, people who are influenced to target us, and the pre-stacking all come together in this perfect storm of some kind of way to keep us confined, enslaved, keep us blaming ourselves for the way we can't break out of these cycles, and we eventually reach a point of self-destruction or evolution. And the irony is that this choice will come over and over again. So there is physical death. You could think of that as suicide. You could think of that as addiction. Some people argue that cancer and stuff like that is a type of death programming. There's also the kind of death where you put others before self. You stay involved in harmful relationships. You put off your own growth. There's also selling out to the matrix, chasing the false dreams and the money and all of that, chasing pleasure. Those are all types of death programming, and it's meant to bring you to a point of self-destruct or evolve. And most of us keep going because we know there's more. For me, I see this death programming come up when I was 17. I had a huge personality shift from stereotypical straight A honor student, play the violin, to goth. Basically, it was a very drastic switch. And that was the point where I met my ex-husband, and that was the point when the actual death programming itself as far as suicide went. And I actually went back and listened to an album that I had listened to over and over and over and over when I was going through this transition when I was 17 and at that point in my life. And the words are very, very programming. It was essentially, you are going to be in love and you are going to die. It was very Romeo and Juliet. And the way the programming was installed is so obvious now, but it's also really creepy to look back on, to be honest. And so then what happened for the next almost 15 years of my life is I went through these periods of suicidal ideation. I had to face that in order to keep going, but I always knew that there was something more. Something kept me going. And I finally have been able to get out of that loop, but it's not been easy. These loops are everywhere in everyone's lives, and they appear differently for different people. But the point is to keep you from evolving spiritually, evolving as a being, as a person, and ultimately to keep us in this matrix. So the point of this whole thing is that when we are given these frequencies, when it hits a resonance, when something comes up and we're triggered, we have to make a conscious, intuitive choice not to run the programming. And it sounds simplistic, and it is simplistic, but it is hard. When you are triggered, it is hard to make a conscious, intuitive choice. So the first step is recognizing that it's coming up. And then eventually you'll be able to say, no, I don't want to run this programming. Yes, this person yelled at me. I'm going to make the choice to not be triggered by it, to respond rather than react, and to not blame myself or whatever it is that's coming up. The whole point of the game is to take away our conscious choice. And so we have to slowly program ourselves to start making that conscious choice. That is the whole point. If you found this episode helpful or insightful, please share it with a friend and leave a review or comment. Make sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. I host twice weekly open discussions on the podcast topic on our Discord server. If you'd like to join, head to dimensionalshifter.com/Discord. If you're on Reddit, come join the subreddit r/dimensional shifters or send me a DM. My username is Dimensional Shifter. Keep deprogramming, keep connecting, keep listening to your intuition. This is it. This is what we've been searching for our whole lives. Connection to our true selves.